Hi everyone and welcome to Pro Tools Answers, where three Pro Tools experts usually demonstrate and elaborate on your Pro Tools questions put to the community in Avid's official Facebook support forum. In this week's episode, we're talking about a question from Nicholas, and he is asking this. Help! The MIDI track shaded in blue does not play. What should I do? When I create a new one, it also comes out like this, disabled. Joining me to answer this very simple question today is someone who enjoys just as garish shirts as I do.
Yes.
Avid's own Mr. Andy Hagerman.
How you doing?
So it sounds like what's happening is when he's loading a session up, he's getting a view that kind of looks like this, where the MIDI clip is grayed out, nothing is playing back. I mean, in this case, it'll be because there's no instrument actually on the instrument track. Let's just stick a good old DX7 on there. So there we go. When we have the instrument active, it's a clip colored exactly the way you expect it to. But the moment that you sever the MIDI connection, or the MIDI connection gets severed between the MIDI portion of the track and the instrument, the clip changes color and nothing plays back.
Dave is getting to the good stuff, but I want to kind of take a step back. The problem that this person is having is a matter of signal flow. So Dave showed you how to fix that right there on the DX instrument, but we're going to show where this kind of historically comes from. If you get that MIDI signal flow working, instrument tracks not only make more sense, but they become more powerful. So what Dave has, notice that the MIDI one track has no inserts, it has no sends. Why? Because a MIDI track does not contain audio. MIDI is not audio. MIDI makes no sound, period, end of discussion. MIDI can only control a virtual instrument, or it can control an external hardware device. But old MIDI tracks didn't have inserts to put virtual instruments on. So what we had to do is what Dave's already done on that DX7 track, which is an aux track. He's put a DX7 virtual instrument on there. So on one track, we've got the MIDI data only. On the other track, we've got the instrument only. How do we get them to talk to each other, Dave?
Okay, so with the MIDI track, we still have an in and out section in the same way that we do with all of the audio-based tracks. But the input section defines where the MIDI signal is coming from, whether it be ports, specific channels, or kind of USB-based ports and channels. And then the output defines where that MIDI signal is being sent to. So if we have a MIDI track, as Andy said, rightly, we don't have any kind of audio path inside that. So there's no way to actually sound a MIDI instrument and play back this performance data. So we actually have to manually route that to a specific instrument that exists somewhere on our session. And the moment that we create an auxiliary track, or an instrument track, but we'll just put a pin in that one, and then place an instrument on there, Pro Tools recognizes that MIDI instrument, it picks up the MIDI nodes that that instrument makes available, and it makes those available in the output section of our MIDI track. And as we can see here, we've got two DX7s, one of them on an auxiliary track called DX7, so it actually shows us the track name, and then the instrument on that insert, and the specific MIDI channels that I can route to with inside that system. So if I want to route the MIDI data from MIDI 1 to the DX7 on the aux track, I'm just going to select DX7, I'm going to select the first channel, and there we go. Whenever I hit play, we can see a little bit of MIDI data being sent from there into the DX7. Signal flow, very simple.
Yes, it's simple signal flow, but that is important to understand if you're going to understand what an instrument track does. And I want you to think of an instrument track as being both a MIDI track and an aux track living together on the same channel strip. Instead of having a MIDI track and always having to have an aux track with a virtual instrument on it to hear anything, we can do both things in a single instrument track. The secret to what's going on here is something that most people never even see. And that is a view called the instrument view.
And that's hidden at the moment specifically.
And it's often hidden. So if you go there to the edit window view selector, and we go ahead and pop that and go to instrument, you're going to see, hey, we got a whole new column there. And that column looks an awful lot like the I/O column of a MIDI track. And it does exactly the same thing. All is your input selector. The output selector is right there. So what says none is your output selector. You've got volume underneath that. That's MIDI volume. You've got pan underneath that. That's MIDI pan. There's a little MIDI meter by that. And the mute there is, you guessed it, a MIDI mute.
Yeah, and am I right in thinking that the MIDI meter, Andy, it doesn't show audio because, you know, we even have a meter on the MIDI track that doesn't have an audio path. So it's showing MIDI signal and velocity level, right?
MIDI data of any kind. It can even be controller data. But you're 100% right, 0% wrong. That is not really indicative of what you hear. It's indicative that there is something going on MIDI-wise on that track. The rest of the instrument track, aside from that instrument column, is an aux track. You've got your inserts, you've got sends. In the I/O column, the inputs and outputs are not MIDI inputs and outputs. They're audio inputs and outputs. Could you use the audio input? Yes, if you're using an external device, but generally we don't. If you're using a virtual instrument, you don't need an input. The output is the audio output of that instrument track, just like the audio output of an aux track. Audio volume, audio pan, all that stuff. If you take a look in the track header, you will see record. That record is a MIDI record, obviously, because it's MIDI data. But everything else there is more like a aux track than it is like a MIDI track. Now, here's what happens that gets people screwed up. Dave's going to choose an instrument from there, and let's choose something other than the DX7. An M1.
I just love classic synths. What can I say?
No, I'm with you. So there we go. So we've got an M1, okay? And you'll see here that something very sneakily has happened. Pro Tools wants to make life as easy for you as possible. When you set a virtual instrument up in a instrument track, it says, oh, I'll automatically change my output assignment to match that instrument. Boom. And we're done. So we've got that M1. And now go ahead and play that track, that M1 track. You can see that MIDI data pops on the MIDI meter, and the audio is showing up right next to the track name, like you would normally see on an aux track. Job done, right? And it's playing that M1 instrument, and we know that because of the M1 output. Now, if for some reason, and there's a number of ways that this can naturally happen, if you change the MIDI output of the instrument track to none, now we get back to that gray track that this person was seeing. What you need to do is you need to show the instrument view, go to your MIDI output, and choose the instrument that you want, which is, in his case, almost certainly the virtual instrument that's on that track itself. And you're done.
You're right. This automatically happens, right? You create the instrument track, you put the instrument on there, and Pro Tools automatically makes that connection. And when you reload the session back up, Pro Tools, you would expect that connection to be maintained. But every so often, what seems to happen is that Pro Tools will load up and that MIDI node will just be disabled for some reason. If this is hidden like that and you don't see that MIDI routing, the only clue that you have that that MIDI connection has been severed is because we get that grey track. I don't think there's any rhyme or reason to this. The only thing that I could potentially surmise is that when the DAW is loading the session up, it's loading the instrument up. But maybe it doesn't load it up quick enough for Pro Tools to realize that there's supposed to be an instrument on there and make the connection. And it just loads up with a no connection or a disabled connection, at which point all that it requires is just doing what we're doing here, is just opening up the output and then re-establishing that connection. It's a very simple fix, but we don't know why it happens. It's very rare that it happens. I've only seen it happen a few times, and only once maintained with a session. Whenever I closed and reopened and saved and reopened it again, it's still loaded up incorrectly. No rhyme or reason to it, but that's what's happening.
That's exactly right. And again, Dave says, and he's right, it rarely happens. But when it does happen, you'll scratch your head forever unless you know what the signal flow is. Like I said, it all comes down to signal flow, and to fix this problem. And I'll end with this, is that it seems like you look at this and you go, well, this is unnecessarily complex. All I want to do is create an instrument, put a plugin on there, and automatically, boom. Trust me on this, and this goes beyond perhaps the scope of just answering this question. There are things you can do by having this level of control that you wouldn't be able to do if it was too automatic. It's automatic enough. It wants to set up the inputs and outputs, and it does it, 99.9% of the time. But there's a few times when it won't. And while those cases where something something falls through the cracks, something weird happens, and you lose that connection. While that can be frustrating, especially if you don't understand the question, the power you get by having that level of control is significant, and I use it all the time to have instrument tracks do things that normally people don't do with instrument tracks, which is potentially something we could talk about in another show.
You know, you're not wrong. And there are other platforms that make a lot of this stuff automatic, as you say, a perfect word for it. There's platforms that hide a lot of the complexity in very easy to use menus. And Pro Tools is getting better and better with each iteration and each feature set that makes things a lot easier to understand. You know, being able to route directly to specific tracks, for example, or routing to new tracks that you can create with new tracks dialogue. And this MIDI routing thing is just one of them. When you create that instrument, it just automatically does the routing for you. But having the understanding of what's happening under the hood, I think, as the word you said perfectly, is power. You know, it's because knowledge is power, and the flexibility that the DAW gives you, as well as a lot of the automations that are coming in to make things easier for less experienced users.
Sure,
we literally have the best of both worlds.
Yeah, you know, you're 100% right that there's a few things that we've done that make, you know, certain things that we do, routing to tracks and changing track widths, and, you know, some of the things that you could do now with copying sends and different workflows are now easier than they were before, just because, you know, we're like, hey, you know what, let's sand down that rough edge, right? But there are certain things that we probably aren't going to overly simplify, right? So I don't imagine that the way an instrument track routes MIDI will be simplified beyond where it is right now, because to overly simplify it would take away some of that flexibility. And one thing I cannot sacrifice is the ability to do whatever I need to do in any given situation.
Indeed, and also taking away workflows that could potentially handicap legacy users who are using older, kind of tried and tested techniques, and taking stuff out of the DAW will make their workflows impossible. So it's unlikely that if Avid develops Pro Tools in any way, it's not going to be taking away features. I don't think anything's actually ever been taken away, has it, that I can think of? It's only ever been added to or refined.
I'm trying to think. Nothing leaps to mind. Not in modern history.
No.
Not since the turn of the century.
In that sense, the instrument tracks, I think, are as probably simple as they are going to get, whether you agree that MIDI routing is a simple thing. I think we've shown here that it is a very simple thing to be able to get your head around, one signal going to another place, and the instrument track doing some sort of automation for you, but also giving you the ability to manage it manually as well. It's very powerful.
Yep.
Okay, shall we leave that there? I don't think there's much else we can bash out of this subject.
Yeah, simple question, quick answer. I like it.
All right, then. Thank you very much for watching, you guys. If you got a lot out of this episode, give us a thumbs up. If you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel and you've just found us, please hit that subscribe button and hit the bell icon as well, so you get notified when we upload our latest videos. We do upload every week. If you head over to ProToolsAnswers.com, you can find out a little bit more about us over there, and you can also subscribe to our own Pro Tools Answers Inner Circle over there, which gives you some nice unique user benefits as well. And all that leaves me to say is we will see you guys next week. Thank you very much to Andy.
You bet.
Thank you very much for Anders for not being here. We love you, buddy. And thank you very much to you guys for watching. My name's Dave. This is Pro Tools Answers. We'll see you next time, and we're out.